500 warships bore his sigil across the northern seas, and merchants in a dozen kingdoms paid tribute in gold and silver simply for the privilege of trading with the man they called the Frost Lord. But they forget the cold it took to build it. They forget the man who was marched into a wasteland with nothing but a torn cloak and a broken sword, left to die where no one would ever have to look at his corpse. To understand the Empire, you must first understand the betrayal. And the betrayal began on a morning when the frost had already claimed the inside of the castle's windows before the sun rose. Roderick Calm was 30 years old and had commanded the king's northern legions for 11 of them, winning every border skirmish his monarch had ever asked him to win, bleeding for a crown that had never once bled for him in return. He had risen from the son of a minor landholder to the most decorated general in the kingdom's northern command entirely through merit rather than birthright, a fact the older nobility of Aldous' court had never forgiven him for. No matter how many campaigns his tactics won or how many of their own sons he brought home alive from postings that lesser commanders had gotten killed. He remembered, with a bitterness that never fully faded, the particular condescension of court functions in his early years of command, the way older lords addressed him with a politeness that never quite concealed their contempt for a commoner's son who had climbed too high, the way their wives whispered behind painted fans whenever he entered a room not built for men of his origin. He had believed, in the particular foolish way of loyal men, that service purchased safety, that a lifetime of victories would count for something when the court's endless intrigues finally turned their hungry eyes toward him. He was wrong. King Aldous Varn, aging and increasingly paranoid in the last years of his reign, had come to see Roderick's popularity among the soldiery not as an asset but as a threat, a general beloved enough by his own men to one day, perhaps, decide he no longer needed a king at all. It did not matter that Roderick had never entertained such a thought, had in fact turned down 2 separate approaches from disaffected nobles who had hinted, carefully and treasonously, that the army might follow him further than it followed its king. He had reported both approaches directly to the crown, a loyalty that, in the bitter irony that would come to define the rest of his life, likely only confirmed in Aldous' paranoid mind exactly how much influence Roderick actually held over men who would consider such treason in the first place. The charge, when it finally came, was treason of fabricated correspondence with a rebel faction in the eastern provinces, a letter Roderick had never written, in a hand that was not quite his own but close enough to convince a court already primed to believe the worst. He was given no true trial, only a formality performed before a throne room packed with nobles who had spent years jealous of his standing and were only too pleased to watch it collapse. He recognized, standing before that assembled court in chains, several faces among the nobility who had once smiled at him during victory celebrations, offering congratulations that had clearly, in hindsight, always concealed a patient, calculating resentment. None of them met his eyes as the charges were read. The sentence was not execution. Aldous, in the last flickering embers of whatever conscience he still possessed, could not quite bring himself to order the outright killing of a man who had saved his kingdom's northern border 3 times over. Instead, he chose a cruelty that let him sleep at night while still ensuring the problem disappeared: exile into the Frustrake, the vast, unmapped ice wilderness beyond the kingdom's northern border, a place so hostile that no formal law needed to condemn a man to death there. The Wasteland would do that work on its own, and the king's hands would remain, in his own mind at least, clean. They marched him north for 9 days, stripped of rank and armor, wrists bound before him rather than behind, so that the guards escorting him could enjoy watching him struggle uselessly against the cold, with hands he could not properly use to warm himself. Roderick remembered every mile of that march with a clarity that never dulled in the years that followed, the way the guard's breath hung in visible clouds each time they mocked him. The specific, deliberate cruelty of a young lieutenant named Fenwick, who had once served under Roderick's own command and now seemed to relish the reversal of their positions, denying him an extra blanket on the coldest of the 9 nights simply because he could. Fenwick had been, Roderick recalled bitterly, a mediocre soldier promoted twice beyond his competence, purely through family connections Roderick had never once held against him, had in fact covered for the man's failures on 2 separate occasions, rather than see a young officer's career ended over an honest mistake. The debt, apparently, meant nothing once the political winds shifted. Roderick did not beg. He had learned long before, in a dozen brutal border campaigns, that begging accomplished nothing against men who had already decided your fate, and that the only dignity left to a condemned man was the dignity of silence. On the 9th day they reached the edge of the Frustrake itself, a horizon of endless white broken only by jagged black rock formations jutting through the snow like the exposed ribs of some ancient buried beast, and the guards did not even bother marching him further in. They cut his bonds, tossed him a single worn cloak, and the broken remains of his own sword snapped deliberately at the hilt so it could serve as neither weapon nor tool. A final petty cruelty from men who wanted him to understand exactly how thoroughly he had been discarded and turned back south without a single word of farewell. Roderick stood alone at the edge of that white wilderness for a long time after their retreating forms vanished into the gray horizon, feeling something in his chest crack in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and then, because there was truly nothing else left to do, he began walking north into a landscape that had never once let a man leave it alive. The Frustrake was not merely cold. It was a cold that seemed to have intention behind it, a wind that found every gap in torn clothing with the precision of a hunting predator. A silence so complete that Roderick could hear his own heartbeat in his ears during the long hours between one landmark and the next. He had commanded soldiers through brutal northern winters before, had seen frostbite claim fingers and toes on campaigns that had, at least, offered the comfort of fires and shared rations and other men to share the misery with. This was different. This was a solitude so absolute it felt less like survival and more like slow erasure, each hour another small subtraction from whatever remained of the man he had once been. He built his first shelter on the 2nd night, a shallow trench dug into a snowbank with his bare, freezing hands, packing loose snow into makeshift walls the way he vaguely remembered soldiers doing on the worst campaigns of his youth, and he spent that first night shivering so violently his teeth ached from the constant chattering, certain he would not wake to see another dawn. He did wake, though barely, his fingers numb and clumsy, 2 of his toenails already blackened with the first signs of frostbite that would, over the following weeks, claim the very tip of his smallest finger entirely a loss he noticed only when he tried to grip his broken sword hilt one morning and found the sensation simply gone, the digit itself withered and blackened beyond saving. A small permanent monument to what this wasteland demanded of anyone foolish enough to try surviving it. The following days blurred together into a single continuous struggle against a landscape that seemed to actively resent his presence in it. He fashioned crude snow goggles from strips of bark and sinew after the wasteland's endless white glare left his vision swimming with painful spots for the better part of a full day, a lesson he learned only after nearly walking off a low cliff edge he had simply failed to see through eyes that had stopped distinguishing snow from sky. He learned to test the ice underfoot with the broken remains of his sword before trusting his full weight to it, a habit born from the terrifying afternoon he broke through a thin crust into frigid water up to his waist, and only survived because the crossing happened close enough to a rock outcropping that he could drag himself, soaked and shuddering, back onto solid ground before the cold could finish what the fall had started. He learned, through trial that cost him blood and skin and nearly his life more than once, the particular grim mechanics of staying alive in a place that offered nothing freely. He learned that the wind came in predictable patterns each evening, strong from the northwest, and that any shelter had to be built with its opening facing away from that assault, or the cold would simply pour in and undo every hour spent building it. He learned that the pale, lichen-like growth clinging to the black rock outcroppings, though bitter and nearly inedible raw, could be boiled in melted snow to produce a thin, foul broth that nonetheless kept the worst of his hunger at bay when nothing else was available. He learned, after nearly losing an eye to it, that the Wasteland's ice storms carried shards of frozen crystal sharp enough to cut exposed skin, and that any journey undertaken during the telltale build of pressure in the air that preceded such storms was a journey undertaken at the risk of being flayed alive by wind-driven ice. He learned, too, through the grim trial of a snare that failed twice before it finally succeeded, how to catch the small, pale hares that occasionally ventured near the rock formations at dusk, their meat stringy and barely enough to justify the hours spent waiting motionless in the cold, but real food nonetheless, the first he had eaten in 9 days that had not come from boiled lichen alone. The first 2 weeks nearly broke him entirely. He found himself, more than once, sitting motionless in his snow shelter for hours at a time, not moving, not eating, simply staring at nothing, his mind circling endlessly back to the throne room, to Aldous' refusal to meet his eyes as the sentence was read, to Fenwick's mocking smile on the 9th night of the march. The anger that eventually replaced that circling despair did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated, slowly, the way frost accumulates on a window overnight, imperceptible in any single moment, but undeniable by morning, until Roderick realized one day that he had stopped thinking about his own death as an inevitability and started thinking about it, instead, as something he intended to refuse for as long as his body would allow. It was in the 3rd week, while following a rock formation deeper into the Wasteland's interior, in a desperate search for better shelter than open snow could provide, that Roderick found the cave. The entrance was narrow, half-collapsed under centuries of ice accumulation, easy to miss entirely beneath a drift of wind-blown snow that had nearly buried it. He almost passed it by, exhausted and half-frozen, before some instinct, perhaps simply the desperate hope of any shelter more substantial than a trench in the snow, made him claw at the ice-choked opening until it widened enough to admit his body. He crawled inside expecting nothing more than a modest hollow in the rock, and found instead a cavern that opened, impossibly, into vast darkness, the sound of his own breathing echoing back to him from a ceiling he could not see. He did not explore far on that first entry, too exhausted and too wary of the dark to venture beyond the reach of the pale daylight still filtering through the entrance. But he noted, even in that first cautious visit, that the air deeper in the cavern carried a strange quality to it, not the bitter, lifeless cold of the surface wasteland, but something subtler, almost warm by comparison, as though some faint heat source existed somewhere in that darkness that the ice above had never quite managed to extinguish. He returned to his snow shelter that night with the first genuine flicker of curiosity he had felt since the throne room, and resolved, once he had fashioned some manner of torch or light source, to explore the cavern's depths properly. It took him 4 more days to construct a workable torch from resin-soaked lichen wrapped around a length of the rock formation's brittle black stone. 4 days during which he nearly abandoned the effort twice, his hands too numb and clumsy to manage the delicate work of binding fuel to a stable core. When he finally returned to the cavern with fire in hand, the flickering orange light revealed a passage descending gradually into the mountain's interior, the walls smoothing gradually from raw, jagged rock into something that looked, disturbingly, almost sculpted too regular, too deliberate to be entirely natural, as though something enormous had carved this passage from the inside, rather than the ice simply eroding it from without. He descended for the better part of an hour, torch guttering low in air that grew steadily warmer the deeper he went, until the passage finally opened into a chamber so vast his single torch could not illuminate its far walls, and there, encased in ice so clear it seemed almost like glass, lay the dragon. Roderick stood frozen at the chamber's threshold for a long, disbelieving moment, torch trembling in his hand, staring at a creature whose existence he had until that instant believed belonged entirely to childhood stories and court minstrels' exaggerated songs. It was enormous, coiled in on itself in the specific posture of long, deep sleep, scales the color of tarnished silver visible beneath the clear ice that entombed it. A single massive foreleg extended as though it had simply lain down mid-motion and frozen in place over some span of time Roderick could not begin to guess at. He could not tell, in that first stunned examination, whether the creature was alive or merely perfectly, impossibly preserved, a corpse frozen at the exact moment of death rather than a sleeper waiting to wake. He approached with a caution that felt entirely inadequate to the moment, pressing his bare palm against the ice near the great skull, and felt, or perhaps only imagined he felt, the faintest suggestion of warmth radiating outward from beneath the frozen surface, not the warmth of life exactly, but not the absolute, dead cold of the surrounding rock either. Something in between, something waiting. He did not know, in that first trembling encounter, that he was looking at the resource that would eventually rebuild his entire existence from nothing. He knew only that the dragon, whatever its true state, was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, and that its presence in this frozen tomb explained, at last, the strange near warmth he had sensed in the cavern's outer passages, some faint residual heat bleeding outward from whatever slow, ancient magic kept this creature from freezing entirely solid even after however many centuries had passed since it first came to rest here. He remained in that chamber far longer than caution should have allowed, his torch burning dangerously low, simply walking the perimeter of the ice-bound creature and taking in details his exhausted mind could barely process. The dragon's horns, visible through the clearest sections of ice near its skull, curved back in a pattern unlike anything depicted in the handful of bestiaries he had studied as a young officer, ridged and dark as old iron, rather than the pale bone such creatures were always described as bearing. Its wings, folded tight against its body, showed membranes so thin and fine it seemed almost translucent, even frozen, veined through with something that caught his torchlight and returned it in faint threads of color that had no business existing in a place this cold and this dead. He found himself, in the strange, exhausted delirium of that first extended visit, speaking aloud to the creature, quietly, the way a lonelier or more desperate man might speak to the only company he had left in the world, apologizing, absurdly, for intruding on its rest, and promising, with no real understanding of why the promise mattered to him, that he would not disturb it carelessly. He did not know, walking back toward the cavern's entrance as his torch finally guttered and died, whether that promise had been heard by anything at all. He would spend the following decade slowly, gradually, coming to believe that it had. The brutal grind of understanding what he had found consumed the following months, and it very nearly killed him more than once. His first instinct, born of desperate hope rather than sound reasoning, was to try to free the dragon from its icy prison entirely, believing that a living dragon might somehow prove his salvation, protection, transportation, some miraculous solution to his exile that his exhausted, half-starved mind conjured in the depths of his loneliest nights. He attempted, with tools no more sophisticated than sharpened rock and his own aching hands, to chip away at the ice encasing one massive foreleg, working for hours at a stretch until his fingers bled and cracked in the cold, and succeeded only in exhausting himself entirely while barely scratching the surface of ice that had, he came to understand, formed not through ordinary freezing, but through some deeper, stranger process bound up with the dragon's own dormant magic. The first real injury came when a chip of that ice, dislodged after hours of careful work, snapped back against his forearm with a force that should have been physically impossible for a fragment so small, opening a gash that bled freely despite the numbing cold and left a scar that would remain pale and strange textured for the rest of his life, never quite healing the way an ordinary wound should. He understood, nursing that injury alone in the dark, with nothing but torn cloth to bind it, that the ice was not merely frozen water. It carried something of the dragon's own nature within it, resistant to ordinary force in ways that ordinary ice should not have been, and that any further attempt to simply hack his way through it by brute strength would only cost him more blood for less progress. He changed his approach after that injury, forcing himself to slow down, to observe rather than attack. The same discipline that had once made him an effective commander now turned toward understanding a problem that could not be solved through force alone. He spent days simply sitting near the ice, studying the faint patterns visible within it, noting that certain sections seemed thinner, more workable than others, specifically the areas nearest the dragon's exhaled breath, frozen mid-plume near its great nostrils, where the ice held a different, more brittle quality than the dense, nearly impenetrable mass encasing the creature's body proper. It was there, working carefully at those thinner sections over the following weeks, that Roderick made his first true discovery that fragments of that breath ice, properly harvested and allowed to slowly thaw in a controlled manner rather than melted by direct heat, released a fine, silvery vapor that, when inhaled in small, careful amounts, dulled pain and warded off the worst effects of the Wasteland's killing cold for hours at a time. He learned this by accident and very nearly died of the lesson, breathing in too concentrated a dose during an early experiment and collapsing into a deep, dreamless unconsciousness that lasted the better part of a full day, waking disoriented and nauseous, but alive, with a newfound hard-won respect for exactly how carefully this substance needed to be handled. He spent the following 2 months refining his understanding of what he came to call frostbreath crystal, learning the precise, painstaking process of harvesting small fragments from the thinner sections of ancient breath ice without disturbing the dragon's deeper, more dangerous slumber ice, learning to control the rate of thaw using nothing more sophisticated than careful placement near his small fires, learning the exact dosage, measured crudely but consistently through trial and repeated near disaster, that provided genuine relief from the Wasteland's cold, without risking the deep unconsciousness that had first taught him the substance's power. Twice more during those months, he misjudged a dose and woke hours later than intended, disoriented and vulnerable in a wasteland that offered no mercy to the incapacitated, and once he nearly lost 2 fingers entirely to frostbite suffered during one such extended unconsciousness, saved only by the desperate, clumsy first aid he managed to administer to himself upon waking, packing the blackening digits in what remained of his torn cloak and forcing circulation back into them through sheer, agonized willpower. He kept a careful tally of every failure scratched into the cavern's outer wall alongside his day count, a habit born of the same disciplined record-keeping that had once let him track troop movements across an entire border campaign, and it was that discipline, more than any single flash of insight, that eventually let him distinguish a safe dose from a dangerous one with something approaching real confidence. By the end of that grinding, injury-riddled apprenticeship, Roderick had produced a small store of properly cured frostbreath crystal, carefully wrapped in layers of the cavern's own insulating ice moss to prevent premature thawing, and had transformed, in the process, from a broken exiled general into something closer to the patient, methodical survivor the Wasteland demanded. His hands, once a soldier's calloused but whole, now bore the permanent marks of frostbite and old cuts that never quite healed cleanly, his missing fingertip a small daily reminder of the price this place extracted from anyone who wished to remain within it. He learned, too, in those grinding early months, that the dragon's chamber itself seemed to respond, however subtly, to how carefully or carelessly it was treated. On the 2 occasions when his growing frustration had led him to work too roughly, hacking at the ice with more force than patience, he had noticed afterward a faint, almost imperceptible dimming in the pale ambient light that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the ice itself, as though the chamber's strange half-warmth had recoiled slightly from the violence done to it. When he worked carefully instead, slow and deliberate, the light seemed to hold steady, even on certain quiet nights, when exhaustion made him more attentive to subtle things than usual, to brighten faintly in a way he could never quite prove wasn't simply his own hopeful imagination. He began, without ever fully articulating the decision even to himself, treating the dragon less as a resource to be exploited and more as a slumbering presence to be respected, a shift in attitude that cost him nothing in practical terms, but that he came over the years to believe had mattered more than he could easily explain to anyone who had not spent as many solitary hours in that chamber as he had. The physical toll of that apprenticeship extended well beyond his ruined hands and missing fingertip. He developed, through months of repeated exposure to the crystal's fine silvery vapor, even in carefully controlled doses, a persistent cough that never fully left him, a rasping reminder in his chest on the coldest mornings of exactly what he had breathed in pursuit of understanding. He lost, over that first grueling year, nearly a quarter of his body weight, his once solid soldier's frame reduced to something gaunt and sharp-edged, sustained only by the thin lichen broth and whatever meager game he managed to snare in wire traps fashioned from unraveled thread pulled from his own increasingly tattered cloak. There were nights, particularly during the deepest cold of that first winter, when he genuinely believed he would not survive to see the crystal trade that would eventually save him. When the only thing that kept him crawling back to the cavern each morning, rather than simply lying down in the snow to let the cold finish what the king had started, was a stubbornness that had outlasted every reasonable justification for continuing. The first coin came, as it so often did in stories like his, from men who had no business surviving so far north at all. A trading caravan of Ashevale nomads, hardy, wind-scarred traders who ran a precarious circuit along the Frustrate's southern edge, dealing in furs and rare northern minerals with the kingdoms south of the frozen line, passed close enough to Roderick's cave system that their scouts, investigating an unusual thread of smoke from his carefully banked fire, discovered him before he discovered them. Their leader, a weathered, one-eyed woman named Iseult Gray, approached his camp with the wary caution of someone who had survived this wasteland long enough to know that anyone found alive out here was either extraordinarily capable or extraordinarily dangerous, and quite possibly both. Roderick did not attempt to hide what little he had built. He met her instead with the same calm, unhurried authority he had once brought to negotiating troop movements with border lords, offering her a single small fragment of frostbreath crystal, properly wrapped and stabilized, and explaining plainly what it did relief from cold, a controlled, measurable easing of the wasteland's worst physical toll, a substance that existed nowhere else in the known world, because its source existed nowhere else in the known world. Iseult tested it cautiously, inhaling the smallest possible amount under Roderick's careful instruction, and the visible, immediate relief that crossed her weathered features told Roderick everything he needed to know about the value of what he had found. She offered, initially, to simply trade him a season's worth of supplies for his entire remaining stock, a deal that would have solved his immediate needs but left him with nothing to build toward. Roderick refused and negotiated instead for a standing arrangement, a smaller, regular trade in exchange for tools, proper cold weather gear, and crucially, information about the wider frustrate that his own limited exploration could never have gathered alone. He was careful, in that negotiation, never to reveal the crystal's true source, allowing Iseult to believe it came from some rare mineral deposit he had discovered, rather than from the frozen breath of a sleeping dragon, understanding instinctively that the truth, if it spread, would bring hunters and treasure seekers far more dangerous than any trader currently interested in his goods. Iseult took the deal, impressed despite herself by the calm, calculating confidence of a half-starved exile who negotiated as though he still commanded armies, and the tools she left behind, proper knives, cordage, materials for a real shelter rather than a snow trench, and enough preserved food to ease the constant grinding hunger that had defined his first months alone, became the foundation of everything Roderick built afterward. Before her caravan moved on, Iseult offered him one further piece of unsolicited advice, delivered with the same weathered practicality she brought to everything else, that a man alone in the frustrate with something valuable enough to trade was a man who would not stay unnoticed for long, and that he would do well to find himself people he could trust before the wrong sort of attention found him. First, word of a reclusive trader dealing in a miraculous cold relief substance spread slowly through the Frustrate's sparse network of nomads, smugglers, and border runners over the following 2 years, and Roderick began deliberately offering shelter and a stake in his growing operation to the kind of desperate, discarded people the wasteland's edges always seemed to accumulate deserters from border. Garrisons who could not return south without facing execution for their desertion, debtors fleeing creditors who had chased them to the very edge of habitable land, a handful of Ashevale nomads themselves who had been cast out of their own caravan for infractions that varied from the serious to the absurdly minor. The first to stay permanently was a former garrison scout named Delwyn, a lean, quiet man who had deserted his post after refusing to participate in the massacre of a surrendering rebel village, and who possessed, more usefully than any of his other qualities, an almost supernatural sense for reading the Wasteland's deadly, shifting weather patterns days before they arrived. Delwyn did not ask Roderick for his story, recognizing in him the particular quality of a man who had also been failed by the authority he once served, and the two developed, over months of surviving the Frustrake's worst storms together, a wordless trust that mattered more than any shared history could have. Then came Brenna, a debtor's widow who had fled north rather than watch her children sold into indentured servitude to satisfy her late husband's obligations, arriving at Roderick's growing camp half frozen and fiercely protective of the two small children she had somehow kept alive through a journey that should have killed all three of them. Roderick's first act upon finding her was not negotiation, but simple, immediate care, and Brenna, once recovered, proved to have a sharp organizational mind that Roderick, increasingly absorbed in the delicate, dangerous work of harvesting frostbreath crystal, badly needed. Within a year, she had transformed his rough system of tallies into something resembling proper accounting, tracking crystal harvested, trades made, and the growing roster of hands that had gathered under Roderick's increasingly formal leadership. Others followed a disgraced healer named Coram, exiled from his own order after treating wounded rebels the Crown had declared enemies of the state, a massive, taciturn former quarry worker called Gret, whose skill with stone and ice proved invaluable once Roderick began the slow, careful work of expanding the cavern system into something resembling a permanent settlement, and a sharp-eyed young woman named Fira, who had simply walked north from a border town rather than accept an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, and who turned out to possess a natural gift for the same careful, patient harvesting work that had cost Roderick so much blood to learn alone. Gret's arrival, in particular, marked a turning point in the physical scope of what Roderick could accomplish. The man had spent 20 years working the royal quarries before a mine collapse he had warned his overseers about and been ignored on, killed 6 of his fellow workers, and left him buried beneath rubble for the better part of 2 days before rescue finally came. The Crown's inquiry into the disaster had, predictably, found no fault with the overseers who ignored his warnings, and Gret had walked away from that verdict with a permanent limp, a deep contempt for authority of any kind, and a stubborn refusal to work under any roof but the ones he built with his own careful, exacting hands. He and Roderick recognized in each other, from their very first conversation, the particular kinship of men who had served loyally and been discarded regardless, and Gret's engineering instincts, applied to a settlement built into solid ice and ancient stone, produced structures over the following years that no ordinary builder could have conceived of. Chambers ventilated to draw warmth from the deep cavern without ever risking exposure of its true source, walls reinforced against both the wasteland's crushing cold and the more immediate threat of anyone who might come looking for what Roderick had found. Fira's arrival brought its own quiet complications and, eventually, its own quiet triumphs. She arrived thin and half-frozen, her feet so badly frostbitten from her journey north that Coram feared for weeks she might lose them entirely, and Roderick sat with her through the worst of that recovery with the same patient, unhurried care Brenna had once shown him during his own early struggles. An act of simple decency that cost him nothing, and that Fira, once recovered, repaid many times over through the sheer, careful diligence she brought to every task he set her. She proved, within a year of joining the settlement, more naturally gifted at reading the subtle signs of workable ice than even Roderick himself, able to identify a thinning seam of breath ice at a glance that had once taken him weeks of trial and painful error to learn to recognize, and it was Fira's growing expertise, more than any other single factor, that allowed the settlement's crystal production to scale from Roderick's own solitary, exhausting labor into something a small trained team could sustain reliably. Roderick built his first proper structure with their help in his settlement's 3rd year, a stone longhouse raised at the cavern's entrance, using techniques Gret's quarry experience made possible. insulated against the worst of the surface wind while remaining close enough to the deeper cavern that the dragon's faint residual warmth could be channeled through careful ventilation to ease the settlement's worst nights. He established, in those early years of growing leadership, the same principle that had once made him an effective and beloved commander, that every hand who worked the crystal harvest or raised a wall held a genuine stake in what they built together, a fair share of trade goods and supplies proportional to their labor, because he understood, more intimately than most leaders ever would, exactly what it felt like to be discarded by an authority that had taken everything and given nothing back. The first blood came in the settlement's 4th year, when a group of desperate raiders, deserters, and criminals of a considerably less scrupulous character than Roderick's own followers, having heard exaggerated rumors of a hidden trading post dealing in rare magical goods, attempted to take the settlement by force under cover of a driving ice storm they believed would mask their approach. Delwyn's uncanny weather sense had, however, already warned Roderick of the coming storm 2 full days in advance, and he used that warning to prepare a defense considerably more sophisticated than his small, still-growing settlement's raw numbers would otherwise have allowed. He met the raiders in the narrow, ice-choked passage leading to the settlement's entrance, a choke point Gret had spent months reinforcing specifically for this eventuality, and the fighting that followed was brutal and merciless in a way that surprised even Roderick's own hardened sensibilities, a battle fought half-blind in howling wind and driving ice, where the difference between defender and attacker came down, again and again. To who knew the terrain well enough to move confidently through a storm that reduced visibility to mere feet, Roderick fought at the front of that defense, driving his notched, once broken sword reforged and properly hilted by Gret's patient smithing work through the throat of a raider who had very nearly gotten past him in the chaos, and felt, in that moment, the same cold. Professional clarity that had once made him effective on a dozen border battlefields, and old soldier's competence resurfacing after years of survival, had nearly buried it. Of the dozen raiders who attempted that assault, 5 died in the passage, killed by Roderick's small but disciplined defense force, or by the storm itself, which claimed 2 more who lost their way entirely in the chaos, and were found, days later, frozen solid barely 100 yards from where they had begun their attack. The rest fled south, carrying word that whatever lay hidden in that particular stretch of the Frustrake was defended by men who would not die easily, a reputation that, over the following years, did more to protect Roderick's growing settlement than any wall or weapon ever could. The peace that followed that first battle lasted 3 years, long enough that several of the newer hands who joined Frusthold in that stretch treated the story of the ice storm raid as legend rather than warning, the way comfortable people always eventually treat the hardships that built their comfort. Roderick did not share their complacency. He had learned, through 11 years of border command before his exile, that peace was never a permanent condition, only an interval. And he spent those 3 quiet years steadily expanding Gret's fortifications, training a second generation of scouts under Delwyn's patient instruction, and, in a decision that cost him considerable private unease, beginning to make careful, deniable inquiries of his own into whether word of Frusteld's true nature had ever reached south to the capital. It had. He learned this in the settlement's 6th year from a nervous southern trader who arrived not to buy crystal, but to warn him, in exchange for a debt of hospitality Roderick had once extended during a lean season, that a royal expedition had been quietly commissioned under the pretense of mapping the Frustrake's northern reaches, an expedition whose true purpose, according to whispers the trader had overheard in a border garrison's tavern, was to locate and seize whatever source produced the rare cold relief substance now commanding such extraordinary prices in southern markets. The trader did not know whether Aldous himself had ordered the expedition, or whether it had originated with some ambitious court faction hoping to curry royal favor by delivering such a discovery. But he knew the expedition traveled with royal authorization and a company of the crown's own frost-hardened border legion, the very legion. Roderick realized with a cold, bitter irony that he himself had once trained and commanded before his exile. Roderick received this news with the same flat stillness he brought to every piece of difficult information, but Brenna, who had come to know him better than almost anyone alive, noticed the particular way his scarred hand stilled entirely on the ledger table when the traitor said the words, "Royal Legion," and understood that whatever calm her leader projected, something old and unhealed had just been touched. He thanked the traitor, paid him generously, and spent that night alone at the mouth of the deep cavern rather than in the longhouse, and none of his people asked him about it the following morning, though all of them noticed. The expedition, when it finally arrived 4 months later, was nothing like the desperate, opportunistic raid of Frosthold's 4th year. It came as a disciplined column of nearly 60 soldiers, well supplied and properly equipped for the Frustrake's brutal conditions, in a way no ordinary raiding party could have managed. Led by a hard-eyed colonel named Rask, whom Roderick did not recognize, but whose bearing and command style he recognized immediately as the product of training Roderick himself had helped establish years before his fall. Delwyn spotted their approach 3 full days before they reached the settlement's outer perimeter, giving Roderick precious time to prepare a defense considerably more sophisticated than the one that had served him against a single raiding party years before. He gathered his people in the longhouse that first night and told them, plainly and without softening, the truth. Exactly what they faced and exactly what it would cost to survive it. He offered any who wished to flee south through the settlement's least known passages the chance to do so, no shame attached to the choice, understanding, as he made the offer, that he was in some sense reliving his own long-ago moment of decision at the edge of the Frustrake, choosing whether continuing to fight for something was worth the pain of it. Not one person chose to leave. Gret, in his quiet, practical way, simply asked what needed reinforcing before the soldiers arrived, and that question, more than any speech Roderick could have given, set the tone for the days that followed a settlement of exiles and outcasts choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to defend the first home most of them had ever actually owned a piece of. The colonel's forces made camp at a cautious distance on the first evening, clearly intending a methodical, disciplined siege rather than a reckless assault, and Rask himself, under a flag of parley, approached the settlement's outer perimeter the following morning to deliver terms, surrender the location, and full knowledge of the crystal's source, and the crown would grant clemency to every soul within Frosthold's walls, Roderick included. Roderick met him at the perimeter personally, and the 2 former colleagues regarded each other for a long, silent moment before Roderick gave his answer. Calm and utterly without heat, that he had already been granted the crown's mercy once, in the form of a broken sword and 9 days' march into a wasteland meant to kill him, and that he had no further interest in testing how the crown's generosity might be revised a second time. Rask's expression did not change, but something in his posture suggested, however faintly, that he had expected precisely that answer and had delivered the offer more as formality than genuine hope of acceptance. The siege that followed stretched across 4 brutal days, fought not in a single decisive clash, but in a grinding series of skirmishes along the settlement's fortified approaches, Rask's disciplined soldiers probing methodically for weaknesses in defenses that Gret and Delwyn had spent 3 years perfecting. Roderick fought alongside his people throughout, refusing every suggestion that he direct the defense from safety, and took a wound on the 3rd day when a soldier's spear opened a long gash along his shoulder in the chaos of a nighttime skirmish near the settlement's eastern approach, a wound Corim stitched closed by lantern light with hands that had grown steady through years of treating injuries. Far worse. 2 of his own people did not survive that siege. Fira, whose gift for careful, patient crystal harvesting had made her one of the settlement's most valued hands, died on the 2nd day defending a supply cache that Rask's soldiers had nearly overrun, cut down by a blade she had never been trained to properly defend against. And Delwyn himself, whose uncanny sense for the wasteland's weather had saved the settlement more times than anyone could easily count, fell on the 4th and final day, caught in the open during a sudden, violent storm his own instincts had warned him was coming, but that he had chosen to weather anyway rather than abandon a defensive position he had sworn to hold. Roderick reached him only after the fighting had ended, kneeling in the settling snow beside the man who had been, in many ways, his first true friend in this new life, and heard, In Delwyn's final labored words, no regret at all, only a request, delivered with the same quiet practicality he had brought to everything else, that someone continue training the younger scouts properly, because the storms would keep coming whether or not he was there to read them. Rask's forces, having taken losses considerably heavier than a mapping expedition should ever have expected to sustain, and facing a defense that showed no sign of breaking, despite the settlement's own mounting grief, withdrew on the morning of the 5th day. Roderick never learned whether the colonel reported the expedition's failure honestly to whatever authority had commissioned it, or whether he simply allowed the Frustrake's brutal reputation to absorb the blame for an expedition that had, officially, never found anything worth the cost of finding it. He suspected, given what he remembered of Rask's own quiet, competent integrity, that it was likely some careful blend of both. They buried their dead at the mouth of the deep cavern, close enough to the ancient sleeping presence below that Roderick, standing at the gravesides in the gray morning light, found himself speaking not only to his gathered, grieving people, but silently, privately, to whatever ancient consciousness might still be listening somewhere beneath the retreating ice. He told his people that Fira had harvested more crystal in 3 years than anyone before her, and that Delwyn had kept them all alive through storms that should have killed them a dozen times over, and that neither death would be allowed to mean nothing, because the settlement they had bled for would grow stronger, not smaller, from what this siege had cost them. In the months that followed, as Frosthold rebuilt and mourned in equal measure, Roderick made the decision that marked, in later years, the true turning point of his exile, no longer content merely to defend a single hidden settlement against whoever came looking for it. He began, deliberately and with Gret's careful engineering help, establishing smaller, discreetly fortified outposts along 2 further stretches of the Frustrace interior, so that no single siege, however well commanded, could ever again threaten to end everything he had built in a single grinding assault. In the years that followed, the settlement grew steadily into what travelers along the Frustrate's edges had already begun calling Frosthold, a permanent settlement built into and around the ice cavern that concealed its true, still unrevealed source of wealth, trading not merely in Frostbreath crystal, but in the growing expertise of a community that had learned, collectively, how to survive and even thrive in conditions that had once seemed to guarantee only death. The scouts Delwyn had trained before his death carried his methods forward, reading the Wasteland's deadly weather patterns with the same patient discipline he had taught them. Coram established a proper infirmary, treating frostbite and injury with a skill that saved more lives than Roderick could easily count. Brenna's children grew alongside a handful of others born within the settlement's walls, the first generation of a community that had not existed at all a decade earlier. Roderick himself descended into the deep cavern chamber often during those years, alone, standing before the dragon's ice-encased form in the flickering light of a proper lantern rather than the crude torch of his first desperate exploration, and he came, gradually, to understand something about the creature that he shared with no one, not even his most trusted followers. The ice encasing it, he had begun to notice through years of careful, patient observation, was very slowly, almost imperceptibly retreating a fraction of an inch here, a faint new crack there, changes so gradual that only a man who visited as obsessively and as regularly as Roderick did would ever have noticed them at all. The dragon, he came to believe with a certainty he could not entirely justify through evidence alone, was not merely preserved. It was healing, slowly, from whatever ancient wound or exhaustion had first driven it into this frozen sleep, and the Frostbreath crystal his entire settlement's fortune now depended upon was, in some fundamental sense, the residue of that healing process, a byproduct of a wound that was, however slowly, however imperceptibly, finally closing. He did not know how long that healing might take. He did not know, with any certainty, what would happen when it finally completed, whether the dragon would wake gentle or furious, whether it would recognize the small human settlement that had grown up around its resting place as trespassers to be destroyed, or as something else entirely. But he found, standing in that vast dark chamber year after year, that he did not fear the prospect the way perhaps he should have. He had, after all, spent his exile learning that the things a king declared worthless or dangerous were very often neither, and he had come to trust his own hard-won judgment about this ancient sleeping creature more than he had ever trusted the judgment of the crown that had once discarded him. By the close of the settlement's 10th year, Frosthold had grown into a proper northern town in all but name, home to nearly 200 souls who had, each of them, arrived at the edge of the Frustreich with nothing, and found, in Roderick's growing domain, a second chance the rest of the world had refused to offer them. The Frostbreath crystal trade had expanded far beyond Isolde Grey's original caravan, now supplying a network of traders who carried it to kingdoms hundreds of miles south, its true source still known only to those within Frosthold's walls who had earned the right to that knowledge. Roderick had built, alongside Gret and a growing cadre of skilled hands, proper fortifications around the settlement's approach, a garrison trained in the specific, brutal tactics that surviving the Frustreich's raiders and storms alike demanded, and a governing council, modeled loosely on the military structures Roderick had once commanded, that ensured the settlement's growing wealth and responsibility did not rest on his shoulders alone. He stood, on the evening that marked the 10th anniversary of his exile, at the mouth of the deep cavern, looking out over Frosthold's lantern-lit rooftops through the passage's opening, listening to the distant sounds of a settlement going about its evening business, the ring of Gret's forge, Corim's voice carrying faintly from the infirmary children's laughter that would have seemed, to the broken, half-frozen man who had first crawled into this cave a decade earlier, like the most impossible sound in the world. He thought, as he often did on such quiet evenings, of King Aldous' refusal to meet his eyes as the sentence was read, of Fenwick's mocking smile on the 9th night of that brutal march north, of the particular arithmetic of a crown that had decided a loyal general's popularity constituted a threat worth erasing entirely. He thought, too, of the dragon sleeping in the chamber below, its ice slowly, patiently retreating year by year, and felt the same cold, patient certainty settle over him that had carried him through every trial since the throne room, the understanding that some debts, however long deferred, eventually came due regardless of whether the debtor believed they ever would. Somewhere south, in a capital that had long since forgotten the general it once discarded to a frozen wasteland, expecting the cold to finish what the throne room's cowardice had begun, that debt was quietly, patiently, coming due. Gret found him there at the cavern's mouth as the evening deepened into full dark, climbing the worn stone steps with the heavy, unhurried tread of a man who had spent a decade learning every inch of this settlement's foundations, and stood beside him in comfortable silence for a long while before finally asking, in his blunt, practical way, whether Roderick ever intended to march south again, now that Frosthold commanded a garrison and a fortune considerable enough to make such a journey survivable. Roderick considered the question for a long moment, watching lantern light flicker across the rooftops of the town he had built from nothing, before answering that he did not intend to go back, not yet, and not as a broken exile seeking to reclaim a rank and a name the crown had stripped from him. When he finally marched south, he told Gret it would not be to beg Aldous for anything at all, and it would not be a plea for reinstatement to a court that had proven, once and decisively, exactly how little his years of loyal service had ever actually meant to it. It would be because the Frustreich itself, and whatever ancient power still slept beneath its ice, had by then grown too large and too undeniable for the crown to pretend it had never made an enemy of the man it once sent north to die. Corim joined them a short while later, drawn by some instinct for the significance of the evening, and the three of them stood together at the cavern's mouth, in silence, watching the settlement's scattered lanterns flicker below, watching smoke curl upward from chimneys that had not existed a decade earlier, watching, in the deep dark behind them, the faint suggestion of pale light still emanating from the icebound chamber where an ancient creature continued its long, patient healing. Indifferent to the small, stubborn human town that had grown up around its resting place, and yet, in some way Roderick could never fully explain even to his most trusted companions, not entirely indifferent either. The empire was not yet finished. It was, on that evening, still only a growing northern settlement of 200 souls, a trade network built on a secret its people guarded fiercely, and a sleeping creature beneath the ice whose eventual waking Roderick could neither predict nor control. But he stood at the threshold between the world he had built and the ancient mystery still slumbering beneath it, with the particular stillness of a man who understood that he was no longer simply surviving his exile. He was, however slowly, however patiently, becoming something the Wasteland itself had shaped him into, something the king who exiled him to die had never once imagined possible, and would, when the reckoning finally came, be entirely unprepared to face. Somewhere beneath the ice, in the deep dark, where no southern soldier and no royal expedition had ever managed to reach. The last of the ancient frost was finally, imperceptibly, beginning to crack,